Sir, when we consider how much greater would be our advantage in defending the air above this island against an overseas attack, I must say that I find in these facts a sure basis upon which practical and reassuring thoughts may rest. I would pay my tribute to these young airmen. The great French army was very largely, for the time being, cast back and disturbed by the onrush of a few thousands of armored vehicles. May it not also be that the cause of civilization itself will be defended by the skill and devotion of a few thousand airmen? These young men going forth every morn to guard their native land and all that we stand for, holding in their hands these instruments of colossal and shattering power, of whom it may be said that every morn brought forth a noble chance, and every chance brought forth a noble night, deserve our gratitude, yes, to all the brave men, in so many ways and on so many occasions, are ready and continue ready to give life and all to their native land. We shall fight in France, we shall fight on the seas and oceans, we shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
Entry from Orange. Compass is US. Repeat, compass is US. Unsure of position. Returning to base. Entry from Orange. 410. Going clear south coast. Sailing out. Repeat, sailing out.
Robert Taylor Glenn Stirling, or Bobby as he was known, was born in Glasgow, Scotland on the 16th of September 1917. He went to his local grammar school where he excelled at sport, especially tennis. After school, he joined the Bank of Scotland, and whilst working for the bank, he enlisted to join the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve, or the RAFVR, as a pilot. He volunteered because the RAF was calling for a larger number of pilots than could be supplied by the normal channels due to the rising tensions within Europe. He was subsequently called up, appointed as a Class F reservist, and joined the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve in 1937. As a Class F reservist, he had to leave his employment for 8 weeks, during which he put in 50 hours of basic flying training. After that, he could return to his civilian job, but needed a further period away from his work later in the year and each subsequent year in which to put in 20 hours or more of flying training. Over the next 3 years, after being called up for service, Bobby amassed approximately 100 to 150 hours of basic training in aircraft such as the Tiger Moth. After this, he was called up to start further training and was posted to 15 Flying Training School in September 1940 to start advanced flying training on frontline fighter aircraft. 3 weeks later, he was sent to No. 6 Operational Training Unit at RAF Sutton Bridge on the 22nd of September 1940 to train for frontline squadron duties. This final part of the training only lasted 4 weeks or so, at a time when the Battle of Britain was at its peak, pilots were in short numbers, and where the average lifespan of a fighter pilot was only 4 weeks. After passing out from training school with a minimum of hours and virtually no experience, Bobby was given the rank of Sergeant Pilot, and on the 30th of October 1940, he was posted to 87 Squadron, which at that time was based in Exeter. Over the next 2 weeks, he carried out a number of day patrols until mid-November, after which he spent the next 6 weeks training for night patrols. In December 1940, 87 Squadron moved to Charmy Down, an airfield about 3 miles northeast of Bath, to fly night patrols over the West Country. Towards the end of 1940 and through 1941, the Hurricane was the principal single-seat night fighter aircraft in Fighter Command, though without much success due to the lack of radar. 87 Squadron often operated out of other West Country fighter airfields, such as Exeter and nearby Cologne, for various reasons such as to bolster up aircraft numbers or for weather issues. And it was on one of these occasions, with very misty weather around Charmy Down, that 23-year-old Sergeant Pilot Robert Stirling took off from Exeter at 8:45 p.m. in the evening of Friday the 11th of April 1941 for a routine night patrol in his Hurricane Mark I, serial number P3593.
9th April 1941. My dearest Betty, I hope you are keeping well, and that Jerry is not causing too much damage north of the border. I have been keeping myself busy, despite only going up a couple of times in the last 2 months, due to the weather we have been having down here in the West Country. Our CO has been keeping us active with games that keep us on our toes. However, this month I have been on patrol half a dozen times already so far, partly because Jerry has been throwing in the extra raid on Bristol, and partly because the weather has improved greatly. I did a double patrol last night, with the last one finishing around 2:30 AM. When I was up there, I thought about you, and when we will see each other again. Tomorrow, I'm going to leave here and fly to Exeter, as the weather boys have told us that Charmy Down is due for some fog. 3 of us, including Harry, are flying down tomorrow morning, and will be there 3 days apparently. Pray that this wretched war will soon be over, and that we can be together again soon. Love as always, Bobby.
The weather system that day showed an area of high pressure centred off southwest England, and for the Exeter area there was a light to moderate northwesterly breeze with some mist in the evening. During this patrol, he made contact with the German bomber and gave chase, which ended up with him heading in a southerly direction towards France.
X-ray from Orange, chasing bandit, heading south. X-ray from Orange, compass is US, repeat compass is US, unsure position, returning to base. X-ray from Orange, low on fuel, believe near south coast, sailing out, repeat sailing out.
So after having left Exeter Airfield at 8:45 p.m. on the 11th of April 1941 and running into compass issues on his aircraft whilst chasing a German bomber towards France, he was flying around trying to get his bearings whilst at the same time his fuel reserves were getting low. Then he suddenly saw the reflections of what he thought was the Right Cliffs of Dover, which actually turned out to be greenhouses on the island of Guernsey. At that time, Guernsey had a large number of glass houses due to its tomato growing industry. His fuel gauges were now showing empty, and rather than make an attempt to crash land in the dark, which would probably have been fatal, he decided to parachute out of his aircraft instead. Can you imagine how difficult that was? Picture the scene. Jumping out of an aeroplane at night time with a parachute, landing on the ground, uninjured in one piece. The chances of that happening were fairly slim, but Sergeant Stirling that night managed it. So he's down on the ground in one piece. The next thing he does is to hide his parachute in some vegetation. Although he thought he was near England, because he thought he'd seen the White Cliffs of Dover, in reality, he didn't really know where he was. So once he was down on the ground and his parachute was hidden, he was very cautious about where he was going to go. And that night, the moon was out. He must have seen in the east land, which was Guernsey, and he headed for that land. At the time he landed on Lihou Island in April 1941, there were no Germans stationed here, so his route across to Guernsey was totally clear. So you can see how lucky he was landing where he did on the grass. You see all the dangerous rocks around Lihou Island. Had he landed on those rocks, then he would have been seriously injured. Although he'd never been here before in his life, incredibly, he made his way to the causeway and ended up heading towards the headland at the other side of the causeway. We know he walked across this causeway in the moonlight, blissfully unaware that he was heading towards German-occupied territory. Although Guernsey was occupied at that time in April 1941, there weren't that many German soldiers stationed here or on this bit of the headland. The numbers increased after October 1941. Sergeant Stirling had come across the causeway, made his way up on the small shingle bank here to the right of me and up onto this long rectangular piece of grassland. But unbeknown to him, this area was full of mines, and 2 months previously the Germans had laid 50 anti-personnel mines. So this is the German anti-personnel mine. It's an S mine or shrapnel mine, and it was buried in the ground with just the top of these little pressure prongs sticking out. So when someone would come along and tread on these prongs, that would then set off a small charge which would then propel the inner canister from the outer canister, which remained in the ground, to about 3 feet in the air. And at about 3 feet in the air, it was time to explode. And inside this particular section here, there's about 360 ball bearings, or they were small pieces of shrapnel. And they would explode and they would go out in all directions, and they were fatal to within 20 to 30 meters, and they would cause serious injury up to about 100 meters. At this stage, it had taken Sergeant Stirling about half an hour after landing on Lihou Island to get to this point here on the northwest part of the Lihou headland.
So Sergeant Stirling had made his way from the corner of the headland over there and clambered over all those rocks on the north part of the headland and made his way here onto this shingle beach, heading in a northerly direction to the slipway in the corner. So Sergeant Stirling had made his way along this shingle beach and found himself here at Lihou slipway. He walked up the slipway, across the main road and onto the track the other side. So Sergeant Stirling had made his way up the slipway, across the main road, onto this track down here until he got to this point here at the house called Lihou.
Bobby then knocked on the door and shouted out that he was an RAF pilot who had parachuted out of his aircraft. Tom Brewer heard this, jumped out of bed and looked out of the window expecting to see German soldiers, but instead he saw a young pilot in uniform outside his front door.
With that, Tom Brewer came to the door and let him in. Sergeant Stirling introduced himself to Tom Brewer, who invited him to sit down, whilst his wife Myra Brewer made Sergeant Stirling something to drink and something to eat.
Bobby soon realised he had ended up in the German-occupied island of Guernsey, and that he would have to give himself up as he could not hide for long and did not want to get anyone into trouble.
Tom Brewer advised against this, saying that he might be shot if he was caught, so he elected to stay until the curfew ended early in the morning.
At 8:45 in the morning, a sergeant and 2 police constables arrived at the house along with a German officer and 2 soldiers to take Sergeant Stirling away. Bobby then asked one of the police constables to get a message to his fiancée via the Red Cross, saying that he was okay. He thanked Tom and Myra Brewer and was then driven away into captivity.
And for Flight Sergeant Robert Stirling, his war was over.
For the next 2 days after Bobby was taken away from the house, Tom Brewer was taken to Lihou Hotel for interrogation, and when it was apparent that he did not really know anything of importance, he was released. Further, one of Tom Brewer's brothers went looking for the parachute later on that day and found it. He disposed of it, but Tom Brewer was not happy at all with his brother for doing this, due to the repercussions of getting caught and sent to a prisoner camp in Germany, or even worse. In the meantime, as he did not return for his night patrol, his squadron presumed he was lost at sea, and this was officially put down in the squadron record book. The next day, his parents received official notification from the RAF that their son was missing in action and that he was last seen chasing an enemy bomber out to sea. It was presumed he had been shot down and ended up in the sea trapped in his aircraft. Then, incredibly, 3 weeks after his parents had received the official notice of his missing in action, their sadness lifted when they received a telegram from one of Robert's aunties who lived in Quebec, Canada. In the telegram, she said that she had been listening to her radio and had personally heard a message broadcast from Germany that said Sergeant Pilot Robert Stirling was a prisoner of war and was in Stalag 9 camp in Germany. One can only imagine how his parents and friends felt upon receiving this fantastic news. 2 days after receiving the telegram, Bobby's parents received official confirmation from the RAF that their son was a prisoner of war but was safe. Bobby was initially sent to Dulag Luft Transit Camp near Frankfurt until May 1941, where he was processed and interviewed before moving to a series of Stalag Luft camps. These camps were prisoner of war camps run by the German Air Force, or Luftwaffe, where Allied aircrew were imprisoned.
My darling Betty, it looks as if our little holiday together this year will have to be postponed. but we'll have a real do when I see you again. I never thought I would be a prisoner of war, but as to how that came about, I cannot tell you here. All I can say is that I had to jump for it, and was unfortunate in being over enemy-occupied territory. But I was really extremely lucky in more ways than one to get off without a scratch. In Guernsey, where I came down, I was treated very well indeed, and I'm sure I was the main conversation of the local inhabitants for the week I was there. From Guernsey, I was transported to my present dwelling place, where I met a crowd of RAF pilots. It was great to get among the lads again, and have someone to talk to, after being alone for so long. There are a crowd of good lads here, and if it wasn't for the fact that I can't see you, I wouldn't be too unhappy. Ask Mother for my other news. I am writing her too. Maybe by the time I come home you'll be married and have had your 4 children. But I hope not. Fortunately I had my photographs with me, so I can keep looking at you. I love you so terribly much, darling, and I cannot say how much I am missing you. Please take great care of yourself now, if only for my sake. You can write me as often as you like, so please do, and always send them airmail as they come quicker that way. I expect you've had a worrying time while I was posted missing, but now you know what's what, you can just keep smiling. Give my love to Ma Scott and the rest of the family. Yours forever, Bobby.
The first camp he was sent to was Stalag Luft II camp in Poland, and he stayed there until June 1941. He then moved to Stalag Luft I in Germany until 1942, before transferring to Stalag Luft III in May 1942 until December 1944. This is the camp he spent the largest part of his time in, and he was there when the Great Escape took place in March 1944. This was a famous escape plot that took place involving digging 3 tunnels. But unfortunately the Germans discovered the tunnels as the escape was in progress, and only 76 prisoners escaped out of the intended 220. 73 of those were eventually captured, of which 50 were executed. Fortunately, Bobby was not involved in this escape plan.
Hugh Stirling Esquire, 2007 Paisley Road West, Cardonald, Glasgow, 16th of April 1941. Dear Mr. Stirling, we are all greatly vexed to hear through the Hillington Road Office today that Robert has been reported missing, and join with you in your anxiety for his safety. It may be, as we truly hope, that he was lucky enough to be picked up. The parents of the boys in the Air Force have indeed a trying time. With kind regards, George Petrie.
Bobby then moved for a final time to Stalag 357 in northwest Germany until the end of the war. He attempted to escape 3 times from the camps, including once on a bicycle, but was caught every time. His memory of those camps were not bad, and he always said that he was treated fairly. He used his time wisely in the camps and studied for his banking exams under the Red Cross examination scheme, and qualified with honours for the certificate of the Institute of Bankers in Scotland. Although the story of Flight Sergeant Robert Stirling is a relatively happy one, in that he had survived a parachute jump from a stricken aircraft into enemy-occupied territory without injury, and returned home safely after surviving the last 4 years of the war in various prisoner of war camps, there is a rather bittersweet ending to this story. In November 1944, whilst in Stalag 357 camp, Bobby received some news from a family member that was to have a lasting impact on him for many years. Whilst Bobby was a prisoner of war in Germany, his younger brother Andrew Taylor Glenn Stirling enlisted into the British Army and then volunteered to join the Parachute Regiment. He successfully completed his parachute training in February 1944 and was then posted to 4 Platoon, B Company, 156th Parachute Battalion with the rank of Lance Corporal. Later on that year, the battalion took part in Operation Market Garden at Arnhem, where some 35,000 airborne troops took part in the biggest military operation on Dutch territory during the Second World War. However, this operation failed in its objectives. The 156th Parachute Battalion suffered heavy casualties. Of some 500 to 600 men in the battalion, 98 died, 68 were evacuated, and 313 became prisoners of war. Lance Corporal Andrew Stirling was killed in action on the 25th of September 1944. He was just 20 years old. He is commemorated on the Grosbeek Memorial in the Netherlands, which names more than 1,000 Commonwealth soldiers missing in action in Northwest Europe from August 1944 until May 1945, and whose graves are not known. Bobby was very close to his younger brother and was deeply affected by Glenn's death. He never really spoke about it to his family, and one can only surmise that he felt some guilt that he survived the war and his brother had not.
My darling Betty, I want to get as much off my chest at the moment, to tell you of my thoughts, my beliefs, and my sorrow, which I know you share with me just as much as I did with you in that tragic month 4 years ago. But it wouldn't be advisable in a letter.
I'm still waiting for news from home about Glenn, although I don't suppose it can contain any more than did Nessie's letter. Please don't worry any more about my reactions to the terrible news. I never thought I would be able to take it with so much composure. In fact, I feel rather heartless about my lack of emotion. Possibly, I don't get to realise what has happened.
As I said in my card to Mother, my chief anxiety is how you're all taking it at home. Mother, I know, will have all possible comfort from you and Jean, but Dad has no one of his own sex to comfort him. And dear Ma Scott too will be terribly upset, because it will have aggravated her own grief, especially as it happened in the same month. Give her my fondest love, will you?
I promise you that I will look after myself more than ever now. I've received your 5th and 23rd July and 31st of August letters. The snap of the babe in you is very good, although your face is a bit in the shade. I've also received your letter telling me Carl Sumner had arrived in Glasgow.
I haven't sufficient room to answer any of them now, and less time, as we've just been told the lights are going out at 9, which is in about 5 minutes. Christmas will have passed before you receive this. Hope you don't spend a too sorrowful one, and remember
that I'm thinking of you and loving you with all my heart, all the time. Your Bobby.
Stalag 357 was liberated by the British 7th Armoured Division on the 16th of April 1945, and within the next few weeks he was flown by a transport plane to a personnel reception centre at RAF Cosford in Shropshire, along with many other flight crew from the camp.
Gates that have held Allied soldiers prisoner, in some cases for as long as 5 years. Look closely, you may recognise someone you know. "5 years, and now it's over. British desert rats of the 7th Armoured Division cut through to Fallingbostel in Westphalia to open the doors of this Stalag. A touching goodbye to Hitler, and out of the barbed wire cage to freedom. The Germans have now decided to leave all Allied prisoners behind in camps in the path of the advancing armies. For the German camp commandant, the tables have been well and truly turned."
He then had to undergo an interview about his time as a prisoner of war and also had to have a full medical examination. At this time, he was also promoted to warrant officer, the highest non-commissioned rank possible. Whilst at RAF Cosford, he was invited by the King to attend a garden party at Buckingham Palace on the 19th of June for returning prisoners of war. Soon after this, he made his way to Glasgow and married his fiancée Betty Scott in September of that year. And after a short while longer in the RAF, he left the service and resumed his career with the Bank of Scotland, where he eventually became a manager. Bobby and Betty went on to have 3 children, Glenn, Leslie and Dorothy, and eventually became a grandfather to 8 children, Stuart, Gregor, Fraser, Laura, David, Nicola, Corina and Fiona. At the time Bobby came to the house, on the night of the 11th of April 1941, Myra Bruard was pregnant, and when she gave birth to a son 3 weeks later in July 1941, they named him Robert George Bruard, after Robert Stirling. At some time in the 1950s, he made contact with Tom Bruard with a view to visiting Guernsey, which he did somewhere around 1958 or 1959. He went back to Les Bordes and spent time with Tom and Myra Bruard, where he also met their daughter Pat. After he went back to Scotland, they regularly sent Christmas cards to each other until Bobby tragically died after a short illness on the 4th of December 1987. His wife Betty passed away in 2003. The wreck of Hurricane P3593 has never been recovered, but due to the strong tides around the island and the fact that a lot of the aircraft is made of canvas, not much would be left after 80 years in the sea. Recently, however, new information came to light when the team were approached by a local man who vividly remembered a conversation he had with an old friend of his some 50 to 60 years ago. This friend had told him that whilst diving for shellfish in shallow water off Lihou Island, he had come across the wreck of what appeared to be a World War II aircraft lying in an area of sand. After researching and confirming that only one World War II aircraft was lost near to Lihou Island, the team decided to organise a trip with 3 experienced divers to try to locate any wreckage in the area that this aircraft had been seen. It was understood by everyone involved that the chance of finding anything after so long in the sea was very remote, especially with only one source of information. And after nearly 2 hours in the water, the divers surfaced having seen no trace of wreckage. It was then decided to attempt a second dive, so in September 2021, the same team assembled and went out to dive a slightly different area in the same location. However, like in the previous attempt, nothing was found. One thing is for sure. The aircraft crashed into the water somewhere off Lihou Island or off the west coast of Guernsey, and hopefully one day in the future, some of its remains will be found that will write the final chapter in this incredible story.
You're just as I